ever since. Our key strengths are taking the process from the beginning to the end. So everything from scoping out the project, collecting the requirements, of course the design and the development, and then training and making sure that they can support it themselves. We want to come back, but we want to come back to support something that we've taught you how to do, so we try and do that really well.
And then we do some strategy stuff, governance, BI roadmaps, BI programs, the network of our customers.
Yeah, the whole strategy side, helping people understand how to take their initiatives and make a plan for it. The analysis team is most of our clients, our customer, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
our consultants, we're all mostly West Coast based, and that's where we've been fortunate enough to have most of our business. So travel up and down the time zones is not so bad as across to.
and you might not see our name on newspaper ads or any other ads, but we're mostly referral business folks. So.
Fortunately, yeah. Okay.
So this is an Essbase. The agenda for this is we're going to talk a little bit about Essbase. We'd like to know how much you're comfortable with. We can talk more about what Essbase is or less about it, and then we'll go right into the meat of the tips and tricks. One is how do you make your block creation fast and work accurately? How do you get your users to run more advanced stuff that maybe they only the administrator had access to on a normal basis? How do you use ASO and BSO engines of Essbase together to get maximum performance using the best of both? And then how do you keep your cubes up while they're refreshing?
So let's get a show of hands. Everyone has Essbase in their shop? Yes? Okay. How many people are developers? Administrators? End users? All right. I didn't have to ask who brushed their teeth, because I think everyone pretty much got their arm up. So,
Skip to the next one.
Yeah. Much busier.
So when you had the floppy disk, you just had that little guy in the middle, right?
We had Essbase and we had Excel.
Yeah.
That was all we had.
Right. And now I think in the previous presentation, a lot of you were still here. He talked to the entire scope of the application standard. There's stuff on the data side, there's stuff on the application side. Sitting on top of Essbase. Essbase is now part of Oracle Financials, Oracle Database, increasingly a deeper integration with all their old products. So it's not going away. It's still a fresh technology, still going forward. Us old hands who love Essbase will try to promote it a little bit.
And they're really building it into even the most leading product suites. It's built in as a core function. So it's got a lot of legs. So real quickly, what is Essbase? It's a multi-dimensional database. The dimensions that you define for your database in the outline define the vectors for your business analysis. So if it's a sales database and you want to have a products dimension, you probably have a customers dimension. You can have a measures dimension where you look at sales and expenses and you get profit. And we're using Sample Basic. It comes with every install. Even on version 3, I had they can get Sample Basic.
Except they didn't have the attribute.
Didn't have the last 5 are missing.
And shared member dimensions.
So in this database, we've got 10 dimensions listed in the outline here. Dimensions are typically a hierarchy. So if you have products, you would have rolling, the SKUs maybe rolling up to product families and product groups. And your time is a classic hierarchy. You've got the months rolling up to the quarters, rolling up to the total year. So we've got 10 dimensions. The first 5 I call real dimensions. That's to separate from the bottom 5, which are attribute dimensions. So for the real dimensions in the database, every value is stored at the intersection of one member from each of the real dimensions.
Right. And if you change any one of those, you get a different result out of the cube.
We all know this, right? We're doing good? Okay, cool, great. So the slice and dice, the ability for the users to get the information in the format they want, is great. It's just addictive.
All right. How many of you have worked with dense sparse configurations probably extensively? Okay. So in a block storage cube, Essbase has 2 engines. One is a newer one, which is ASO. The other one is BSO. In a block storage cube, the fundamental storage mechanism are called blocks. And within each block are all the members of the dense dimension. So if you have, say, your time dimension and your measures dimension, every combination of profit in January and profit in February, they're all stored within the block onto the disk. So anytime you can, when you're working with Essbase, now for a developer, you need to understand this really well. But even we found with our clients is you should probably try to explain it to your users. Because when they're running reports, maybe they have access to business rules, and this really factors. And I had a client recently where they had a bunch of reports. They're running over a minute per query. And that's a pretty long time. It's a big queue, but it's a pretty long time. And a minute in a BI world is like eternity. You want to get up and go somewhere else, and you don't want to do it again when you come back. And so we changed the format of the report so that the sparse dimensions were sorted together, and then the dense dimensions were inside of those. And so you did one chunk of dense members at a time. And the report performance went from like a minute and 8 seconds down to 8 seconds. Now, 8 seconds still is not very good, but it was a very large cube. And they were ecstatic at the change. And it was no cube changes, just a slight little tweak on how you use the dense and sparse.
So remember, Essbase, when you take it out of the box, the outline is empty. You get to define the whole realm of the database. So it has to do with the storage unit. What is your smallest storage unit of storage, and how can you work most efficiently with the database? Now, almost always a smaller database is going to be faster. Depends on what you're doing, but as a general rule, you want to have a smaller database. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have lots of data, but you just don't want to have a lot of wasted space. The block storage option actually got a patent for the way that they store data, or more importantly, for the data they don't store. So if I have on the top we see 100-10, that's one of the cola products. If colas aren't being sold in the South, then it won't ever create the block. Seems to make a lot of sense, but this is the key thing. So
it was groundbreaking at that time.
Yeah. So dense and sparse. The dense dimensions define a block, a generic empty block. And then when you associate the sparse dimensions, that's when you've got all the information from the start we saw before, so we know all the data elements.
So there are how many blocks on this slide, Doug, on the right?
Oh, well, there's 5 blocks.
5 combinations of sparse.
Yes. So they're all for the same product, they're all for the same scenario. We know that the measures and time are dense. So I see east, west, south, central, and market. 5 levels. Yeah? Okay. If anyone has a question, we don't have to wait till the end for the Q&A, please.
Now the ASO engine, there are no such thing as blocks, there are tuples. And when it first came out, it was sort of like magic. You fed it tons of data, very large hierarchies, and it just kind of worked out of the box fast. It was magic. But we've had clients where they had a 15 million member product division, which was still not done to SKU. It loaded and calculated in less than 3 hours, and the retrieval time was still fast. Crazy fast. You couldn't do that in block storage. It would be impossible. Almost impossible.
I think it would be impossible. Yeah. Okay. So a block storage database, the rule of thumb is roughly between 5 and 8 dimensions is a good number. Now, of course, it matters to how many members you have in the dimensions. You can have a few 100,000, no problem. But in the ASO world, it's just almost limitless, millions of members. So originally ASO was going to be the block killer. It was going to be the end of BSO. Everyone thought, oh, it's time to get off of it. And that's not really at all the case.
Now, from a user perspective, they look the same. You know, you're in SmartView or financial reports or OBIE, it's going to look the same. And if you're a programmer, it actually responds the same to your code.
So the first tip and trick we want to talk about is how to get your calculations to work correctly every time, and to do it in the most efficient way you can. We talk about the fewer blocks you're processing, it's generally going to take you less time, almost as a solid rule of thumb.
So if a block storage database is made of blocks, the less blocks you work with, the better off you are. And then when you're working with them, depending on how you write your calculations, sometimes it's not going to do what you think it really should do.
Or worse, it looks like it works, but it isn't working in every combination.
So my rule of thumb when designing anything for planning, Essbase, whatever, is if you can model in Excel, you can do it in a system. If you can't model in Excel, it can't be done because it can't be done. So, but the thing is, sales equals 1,000 works in Excel, but it doesn't work in Essbase out of the box. Why is that?
That's because if you just ran that command and if it created blocks for every value you wanted to set, it would automatically fill up your whole database. It could easily take your server offline.
Yeah.
It's just going to run away.
Yeah. 10,000 products times 1,000 profit centers across several different scenarios. You know, you multiply those factors and you have millions or billions of blocks, and they could be very large.
So there's actually a database setting to create blocks on equations by default. It's off. I would leave it that way. We're
There
going to show
was a
you.
bug in, I think, in a version 5 or version 7 version, where it would turn it on when you copied it from one application to the other. Learn the hard way.
Don't worry,
Check it every
it
time.
wasn't in 3. That's just amazing. Let's see if I have the floppies still. So what we talked about was a calculation that doesn't always work. We've got a scenario where we want to take all of the January numbers from the actual, populate them into the budget, and then up them by 5%.
Makes sense. Right?
Simple enough. So I wrote this calc script.
And it didn't work.
Didn't work
Sometimes.
sometimes.
Now, in today's CalScript world, there are commands that you can use to force block creation automatically. It used to be that you had to design your CalScript so that it would force block creation. Now, this is another case where it will not create that budget block. It's a sparse member. It's a new block that has to be created. And doing a calc that essentially is a dense member on the left side of the equation and a dense member on the right side of the equation won't create a new block. So if you ever had a CalScript that performs sometimes but doesn't perform other times, the sometimes it did work is because the block is already created. Meaning you loaded data there already, or you did a data copy command there already. Did something to create that block.
So you have to populate the first key to be created?
Well, there's a couple solutions we're going to show you. One is you can explicitly create the blocks using a command. Like you said, there's also a couple settings that you can set in the calc script now to do it. Although the tricks we're going to show you, the approaches, do the same thing with the same efficiency. It really just is that, if you don't want to think about it, if you don't want to have testing, you might throw in that setting. But again, you want to make sure that you're dealing with as small a part of the data as you should be, because otherwise it's going to run through all these other combinations. And it will actually create blocks that you may have not deliberately wanted.
All right, so some of the things you could do. There's a data copy command. Well, we've already seen that. There's a calculation method where you put a sparse dimension on the left side of an equation and a sparse dimension on the right side of the equation, and that will actually create a block magically. There's the allocate command, which showed up, I think, in version 7 or version 9, and that one actually will create blocks. Very sophisticated command. And there's a set commands now. Basically, you can run the cal script, and then somewhere in between it says, you can tell it, well, start creating blocks on equations.
For this next little step, go ahead and create the blocks.
And then
you
turn it off. Because it's really dangerous. And you can create blocks using data loads. We've done this in the past, distant past, but
Yeah. I think now with the admin,
So
create
which is
ones.
the best way
Hmm?
to use? Which is the best way? Did you say there are a couple of options?
There are.
Is that-
yeah, we'll show you a couple of cal samples.
Right. So you're going to recommend the best way to do it?
Um,
Or depending on the case?
It depends on the case, so we're going to show you how you evaluate it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Want to talk real quickly before we get into the solutions about how important it is to test. So if I was in my development database and I had actually already somehow created a block in the budget, and I'm using that one as my review of my calculation results, it's going to look like it's working. So one thing is to keep your load data and your calculated results in a separate part of the database. Then one of the things you can do is before you initialize the budget, you just blow it all away. Just clear the data. And then now if the calculation works, it's working.
So in that sense, you have two separate buckets, one for system source, one for user inputs. You can audit them separately, and then when you combine and run your budget, it's a repeatable process. You can run the same calc over and over and over again and get the same result, which is really critical. If you're using the same scenario to have data loaded to it and then have inputs loaded to it and have calculations on top of it, it's really hard to unwind and see where things have gone off the rails.
And I've seen so many times where the test data is static, and so the previous results allowed the next step to work correctly, but they wouldn't have been there. Over and over, we've helped people find out that, well, yeah, you are dividing by the total of all the stores, but you're dividing by the total that you had last time, not with the current data load. So testing, and the other thing is to make it part of your development cycle. When you for writing a calc script and your test, you write your test then, and leave notes to yourself. I use a lot of Excel workbooks. This is what I was looking for. This was the condition. This is what I was testing. Because you're going to have to repeat them again. If you write code for 2 or 3 weeks, 20 different calc scripts, and you go back and you start testing it, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, some of the new programming languages, you have to build your code inside of a testing framework. Now, Essbase, you don't have to do that. It's very flexible. You can just deploy lots of code, but the testing rigor has to come from the developer, not by that tool. So a few examples, and we talk about what's less efficient, what's more efficient. When we talk about dense and sparse, a number of blocks, the first example here creates the blocks first with using a data copy. And then you can run any calc you want after it. It'll work. The only downside of this one is you're doing 2 steps. If you have, say, 1,000 blocks, you're running across 1,000 blocks, and then you're running across them again, and that's maybe takes twice as long. And if you have a small database, you wouldn't even notice. If you have a big database, then you would really
make a difference, yeah. The second example is we do a fix on a dense dimension. In this case, it's January. Then you say budget equals actual times 1.05. So you've got a sparse operator, a sparse member on each side of the operator. This will create the block, but because it's a sparse formula, it's going to do extra reads and writes through the more combinations of the data than you really need to be doing.
Fixing on a dense member means you've fixed on the entire database. So now it's going to have to evaluate every block in the entire database. Now this will work. It'll do everything you want it to do. It'll just do it a little slowly. Now the third example is the most efficient example. If you look at the database stats, you'll see that it will have 0 reads on the dense dimensions. It'll have very little blocks that's coming out of memory, and it's going to be the fast. So in this case, we're using what's called a calc member block. It's just like if you think about putting a formula on a member in the outline as a dynamic calc. This is the same idea you could put into a calc script. So this focuses on budget. It will only run it with the blocks that are existing that it finds within the formula. It's significantly more efficient than the other two.
I have another question. How would you know if it's not created? I mean, the block is not created yet?
Oh, well.
Because we went to each issue and then we never moved until later because the block was not created.
Well, how would you know? There's a couple things you can do. You can look in the Essbase log and see how many blocks were created. Every calc script doesn't have to run to create blocks in order to work correctly. It's just that when you're writing this, is one of those things you have to consider. So here's an example where you just set up your spreadsheet and you're testing it there. And so if you clear out the budget, do a clear data on it, or a clear block, and then you run your calc and you get results, then you know it's working.
Now, if you're using the same scenario over and over again, then it becomes really tricky. Because if you add a new product or a new cost center, and that block's not yet been created, and then you run the same calc script, you expect it to work, it might not work.
Yeah.
So that's where keeping them separate and then planning for block creation in your calc script really makes a difference.
Because we have a calc script that's working every month, and until 1 month it's not working, so we don't have any change.
Mm-hmm. Did you change years, or did, yeah?
That's
the new
That-
year might
it
be-
sounds like you may have a block creation issue.
right.
All right, any questions about block creation?
Now, we said that there's setting. There's the setting for create non-missing blocks and create blocks on equations. Those are in your database administrator's guide. So we didn't want to repeat that stuff. This next one is cool.
All right, so tips and tricks number 2. This is more of a trick. Very much a trick. In about version 7, Hyperion introduced custom-defined functions into Essbase. Now, the original intention was they wanted to give more math power to the engine, more for statistical stuff. And that lived on for quite a while. And it's still in the product, but people aren't really using it very much. Now, turns out, what it really is you're able to take a Java program and make it as a plugin to Essbase. And then the way that you would use it is you would run a calc script and you would kick off that Java program. Now, being that it's Java, it can actually literally do anything. Is that dangerous?
That's a little bit dangerous, but there's some safeguards. In fact, there's a lot of safeguards.
Yep. So from a user side, you could theoretically, right from SmartView, hit a cal script and load data from a SQL source to your cube. You could run Excel statements on the server side. You could maybe dump some data out and send it to Salesforce. And then from an administrator side, they have very controlled and monitored, you can control and monitor this because the user can only run what you give them access to.
So you think about the different security models across the versions, you can control who can run which calculations. That calculation really is the hook into what's going to run. So why do we care if it runs on the server?
Well, one of the reasons is to be faster. So for those of you that have assigned super users the ability to run batch processes, sometimes you have to log on to a server and run it. Sometimes you have a link on your desktop to run it. Maybe you have to go into Workspace to run something. This is a very convenient way to do it. You're always in SmartView or Excel admin. You can hit the button and just run it from there.
Questions so far? Okay. So a little about installing it. Here we see a picture of the EAS screen that's used to register custom-defined functions once they've written. Just like so much of the Essbase security, you can register it either with a specific application or for all applications. Tells the name of the function.
Yeah. There's an open source program you guys can try it actually. It's free. There's no additional software cost. It would take about an hour to install. From a developer side, there's a few steps that you should know. So, like we said, you can run a cal script and it can run something on the server side. The cal script really you want to run in Excel, which runs a DOS script, which runs another in Excel. So for you, the reason why we do that is somewhere in between that green one there. If it has an error, it's not going to be able to tell the Essbase side that I had an error. So if you run a cal script that has an error, it's going to sit out there and wait for the cal script to finish.
But it's not ever going to finish.
But it's never going to finish. So we have this little multi-layer step, and if you want to know more, I can tell you more how to do that. It's a few simple commands. The batch script, the purple one in between, traps all the errors. You can email it or put it to a log, and so then the cal can run successfully every time.
So this doesn't replace anything that you can't go out and buy as far as an enterprise scheduling package and have that rolled out from IT. You could always call your IT support guy and they'll go to the server and run the job. But this puts it right in the control land for the users. You were talking about a 4-hour data load in Cal. I don't want my calculation to run that long. So you can kick off a process and wait for it to finish, let the Essbase calculation, the user's experiences, it still looks like it's running. Or you can just kick off an user's job, it comes back, they know that it's been started, and then they'll check their inbox to see when it's done.
So, is it pie in the sky? Actually not. We've done this at a couple of clients recently. And they've loved it because they had a very particular problem of needing to put an administrator function in the hand of the user without a lot of server-side stuff or give remote desktop to access to a user in a separate business unit. So one of the clients, they have a lot of divisions that have Essbase cubes. They look pretty similar to each other, but the same thing can mean very different things. For example, one has working budget, and the other one has working budget. And then corporate says, well, let's consolidate all the working budgets together. Turns out working budget on one side was really a playground, and they use working budget 2 as their normal thing. And then product transformations. So it could have been done with some other tools, but because of the complex mapping involved, we decided to use an Excel script to run report scripts against one cube, take it to the corporate side, do some transformations and load it using a load rule, and then run a couple of cal scripts. All that took about 30 seconds to do. Now, the way that the user would run it though, corporate side, business unit 1 through 50, was to just hit a button to run a cal script. And boom, 30 seconds later it's done, it works predictably, and they were quite happy with it, turns out.
Yeah, so that's an example of moving data between 2 cubes and doing the complex maps. But you can also go out to other external sources. Go out to Salesforce and either upload your new figures or get a recent information. Pulling information from the ERPs that you have. Right. So it really is powerful when things can't be put on a schedule.
Yeah, the second one was that the users had a forecasting system that produced product level forecast. The problem is they couldn't schedule a load out of that system on a regular basis, not nightly, not every other day, not every third day, because the system was very light, actively worked on system. So at times it was inaccurate or in process, and it wasn't going to be ready at 11 p.m. every night. So what they wanted to do was to let the user decide, okay, I'm going to kick off a load at a certain time. Now, we could have done this a lot of different ways. We could have had them put a little flag file somewhere, and then the flag file gets read by the server, and it triggers a process. But what this was a much more integrated process. They would pull data from the system, they would send it here, they would send it there, and the super user could just do it with a calc. They had a calc to run this part, they had a calc to run an aggregation, they had a calc to load data to a different cube, right from one interface, and then on their timing, not on scheduled timing or administrative timing.
So it's the developers, the administrators that set up what the jobs are and what they do. So you're giving the users a lot of power, but only to do what you're building for them to run.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you notice, this is an example of a cal script running a maxL script. It's
Okay.
running a specific maxL script. The user can't go in and change anything, and they can't send parameters through to override what you're giving them as functionality. Now, a couple of tips though, if you're going to do one of these. If you're going to do one of these, you can always email one of us, and if you need any assistance with it. A couple of tips. One is your cal script should be fixed on one cell. So if you have five dimensions, we'll pick one from each. If you run it for, say, all members of your time dimension, it's going to run it 8, 12, 20, 40, 50 times, right? Or if you run it and forget your product dimension, it might run 10,000 times, right? So you probably don't. And then the other thing to note is, every programming language, if you have a function, if you're using VBA or an Excel function even, when it runs, it returns a value. So you want to make sure you pick an account or some member from another dimension that you don't use for anything else. So here, this account do not use. When this function runs, it's going to return a 0 if it's good and something else if it's bad.
So you don't want to put that into a real data intersection because it will skew.
It will actually override something. Yeah, I made that mistake the first time. That's okay. Yeah. Now, this guy running maxL can then run anything on the server side. There's a shell command in maxL. You can run any DOS script, any batch script. This will work against in Linux. So it's more limited to your imagination and your needs than anything else.
I'm gonna provide you this. No, it's not. There's something on the hour. What is it? 2:15. 3:15. We started at 2:15. Sorry. All right, we're good. 3:05.
Okay, yeah.
Thank
we're
you very
trying
much.
to do.
Any questions on the custom-defined functions and how Bill's figured out how to?
Anyone think they might want to try it?
Yeah, some nods.
Maybe in the future.
Maybe in the future, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would play with custom-defined functions until you get up on a newer version. I think it's been around for a very long time. It may have even
5 or 7.
Yeah.
All right.
Next one. All right. This is great. So remember I told you that when ASO came out, everyone thought it was going to be the block killer, and that would just be the end of it. What people have figured out a way is to combine the strengths of the two to give you something that's better than what either one of them can do. Yeah. So,
Generally, we say ASO is good for very large actuals databases, and BSO is good for input stuff, lots of calculations. Planning is 80% BSO cube underneath, right? But the combination of the two, you can use the power of each. Now, ASO is better for some types of calculations, for example, counting things. If you have 100,000 products and you want to say, well, in a particular month, how many products in this market had sales? If you have to count 50,000 things in BSO, it's kind of hard, actually. It's kind of slow. In ASO, that formula is really easy and it's very fast.
BSO has some really great calculation capabilities that I think generally you can't be met with ASO.
Right.
The ability to do time continuum, the rolling 15-month average and that kind of stuff, it just excels that. So the trick is to create a partition between the two databases. Probably a transparent partition if you want the information flowing live.
Anybody have a partition from cube to cube? So So you could have basically a very large ASO database and a small BSO database, and you have actuals data coming in from the ASO to BSO. But from a user perspective, when they're accessing the little guy, they won't know the difference. They'll just see the data. And it'll be basically the same amount of speed as having it all in your BSO queue.
So how you create the partition has a whole lot to do with how it performs.
Yeah.
So experiment with it if you're going to play.
So one of our clients, they had an actuals queue very large, and they were doing forecasting in a BSO queue. And what they found was they were doing a lot of time functionality for that 13 months, rolling 13 months, seasonality over different time periods, over different years, lots of time-based calculations. So they had their actuals cube with the time calculations. Then they had their block storage cube with the time calculations because that was where the forecast was. And the data would come together and everyone would see the difference. The problem was on the ASO side, those time calculations were actually quite slow. So when the user would hit retrieve, if they just did budget, it would come back in sub-second. If they did actuals and budget, it'd take like 8, 10 seconds. And they couldn't quite figure out how to get this to be faster. The solution was, in BSO, remember the sparse dense stuff? In a block, you have all of your dense members. Right? So in BSO, what they did was, all the data for time comes at the bottom level, goes into the BSO cube, and then the BSO cube does all of the calculations for time. Now, since all of time is in one block, it was instantaneous. So an 8-second retrieval went down to less than 1 second for both actuals and budget combined.
So use the strengths of the two products to bolster the total solution up.
So if you have something in block stores that's running slow, or something in ASO that's running slow, consider having both models in play. You don't have to have just one. You can use the core function of ASO to do calculations and then move them to BSO, and then whatever's good in BSO, leave it in BSO.
I have a question. Like if I'm a smart view and I'm gonna, do I have to either log into ASO or log into BSO? And do I either have to know which one to log into?
No, when you connect to the BSO cube, it looks like it has all the actuals data in it.
Yeah.
So you're in one cube. Let's say that the product, the BSO cube went down to product family because that's the level we forecast at. And then the actual cube goes all the way down to the SKU level. So if you wanted just to see product level, product family level type stuff, you would go to the BSO cube and you would see actuals and budget together. If you as a user need to go down to the SKU level and you're just looking at actuals, you could connect to the SO cube just the same. But the power of the two to combine is that you're just connecting to the BSO cube.
So for your forecasting ability then, you have a very small BSO cube. When you hit calc to calc your budget or some of the forecast, it'll still take a few seconds because it's a small cube. And your actuals cube might have tens of thousands of products and for 20 years, and ASO really handles that stuff really easily. But it would be totally transparent to the user from Smart View, HFR, any tool.
Any questions?
All right, final topic. So I have these large cubes. How do I make sure that my users are not impacted? So any of your cubes, when the refresh, do you have refreshes during the day?
How long do they take roughly? A long time, a month then.
Yeah, they spend hours and updates.
They want it refreshed hourly, and how long does it take to update?
I don't know.
Okay.
A big chunk of that.
A bit, yeah.
Is that just Essbase or is it plain
Essbase. All right, you might like this one. Okay. So this is it's basically a shell trick that you play. You've got 3 copies of the database. There's the one that the users use. You've got the backup that you made from the last version of really the production version. And then you've got the one that you've got off to the side that you're doing the load and the count to. So I don't know if this is always apparent. One of the things, yeah, you can run a calculation during the day while other users are using the system, no problem. But as that calculation is moving through the database and aggregating up results, it's entirely possible that somebody else is retrieving it and seeing numbers that aren't current or consistent. They're wrong. So this is one way you can protect yourself from that. So, yes, you technically can calculate. You just have to make sure that people are aware that it's going on or that the responsible one is reporting their numbers. I guess they have to check them out. It's terrible. So this alleviates a lot of that. It works very nicely with the security. You don't have to do any extra planning or changes like that because it happens behind the scene.
Yeah, in the past, if you had, say, a loading cube and a public cube, and you did a copy, database copy or application copy, the security would move with it. So you'd lose your public cube's security, which would be a disaster.
Well, yeah, and the rest of the Essbase server won't do anything else for anyone else until it's done.
Right.
You-
Or if the process was, let's copy my public cube, make it a loading cube, and then we'll work on it, and then we'll copy it back. Well, then now people have access to 2 cubes, and that's a disaster too. Right? The way this works is, you would process a cube in the background. When it's done, you would shut down both the public cube and the loading cube, so that no one can access it, and then you copy files. Now, this is a trick, but multiple clients have done this, and it's been working for years.
Works in ASO and BSO.
It works in ASO and BSO. You get another advantage of having a backup cube, so if somehow one cube got corrupted, you can just copy one to the other, and it comes back like magic.
Or even just someone says, I know last year's numbers changed. They shouldn't change. Well, you've got a cube that they were looking at either yesterday or last week, whatever your refresh cycle is. This is really helpful if you either have to wait until the morning hour, the work hours to process. Sometimes the data is not available overnight, or if they want midday refreshes. It works really, really well on read-only databases.
Yeah.
So if you've got a large actuals database that maybe takes 2 hours to cook, this is ideal. Now, you can have users in there that are doing lock and sends and calculations. You just have to engineer for that. We're just talking about, our example here is really just for a read-only database.
But we've done where if you have a cube that you're doing a lot of lock and sends, you have to back up the data. If it's a little bit of data, it's quick. If it's a lot bit of data, it takes a little bit longer. The part that's slow in here is copying the files. But slow means 30 seconds or 2 minutes. Now, it's not going to help you get the refresh faster, though, because it has to still refresh, right? That's a function of how much data and the cube design, and if the server's a little older, that certainly will affect it. But at least you'll be able to use it the whole time, and then when it's down for updating, it's about a minute or 2, and it comes back up.
So how about the maintenance here? Like if you are maintaining the 2 applications, like how we can maintain the security? Because every day we need to take taking up a new user, so we need to keep both the applications.
Nope. You're only administrating security to the cube that the users know and love. When we shut down the applications and we move the files over, the security doesn't get updated. There's no change.
What about the metadata?
The metadata is only updated on the loading cube side. So if you have to make a manual change, you would make it on the loading cube side. And then it would propagate to the public cube. If you have to make a change right away, then just make it to both cubes.
But if you're taking a data load and you've picked up 12 new products, they show up in the working cube, and then when you copy over, the users just see it. Now, if you have security like filters based on those new products, you're going to have to wait until it's promoted to be able to set up the security. But product level filters. Yes?
The files you copy over, the PAG, the INV,
The PAG, the INV, the
TCT,
TCT,
ESM. If you want to email us, I can send you a list. It's different for ASO and BSO. ASO, you have to copy 4 directories essentially.
now we have used them.
Okay.
For BSO, it's only a few set of files. Now, if you have files on different drives, so if you have your outline on one drive and your page files on a separate drive, you have to make sure that you copy both at the same time. And it does work on Linux, actually. Anybody have a Unix or Linux environment? Are you mostly Windows or Linux?
Windows and
Both.
It works on both.
You get to write it twice.
Seamless. Yeah. You can't copy from one to the other, but you can within one. And actually, it turns out that this method allows you to copy between servers as long as the drive layer is the same. So if you have a US-based server and a Europe-based server, and you want your Europe users to have their own local version of the cube because of the WAN speed issues, and we've had that a number of places, you can just copy those files and drop them there. And it'll work as long as the D drive is the same as the D drive.
That's when they sent out a self-extracting zip file.
Yeah.
They just delivered it and unwrapped itself and
Boom, cube.
Yeah.
I'm actually not the Essbase person, I do HFM, but our Essbase person is, always has issues with the account deployment because it takes so long. So if we did it this way and we had a new account, So if we can deploy in the working one and let the users be using the other one, and then, okay,
We do the swap, yeah.
Yeah.
It will be down as long as it takes for
right,
the swap.
right. But I mean, it doesn't have to be down 14 hours while, you know,
No, no.
lowering an account because they can still be working. Okay.
So what are some of the risks with this approach, Will?
Well, there are risks. If you have a cube that's growing in size, you know, in the first year you have to set this set up, it has a backup, it's really nice, everyone loves it. Next year you add another year, and maybe you acquired a company, you have, 5,000 more products, we'll keep going, everything's fine. And all of a sudden your server stops one day, because maybe no one was really looking at how much disk space this thing was taking. So if your main cube is 10 gigabytes, and the next cube is 10 gigabytes, and you get backup copy, and another backup copy, and someone created a test copy in production, not dev, you could run out of disk space. And it's happened, so I can tell you by experience, it's not fun. Yes?
Can we do this without the full license of Essbase server?
That's the work of it.
I've never worked with what it is. It's basically, it's the license to have it but not to use it.
No, it's part of the Hyperion.
Yeah, okay, but when it comes in planning, I would guess it would work,
You
but
could,
I
you
don't
could
know.
create multiple planning apps and do it that way. I think that stays within the boundary limits.
All right, so there's a couple other risks, just because, full disclosure. But if I have security filters that are referencing, let's say, a scenario, and then in my work cube I decide to get rid of it, I promote that. When Essbase starts that database up, it's going to go through its filters. Now you've got an invalid filter, so that's really bad. So again, especially if you've got read-only databases, you probably have very, very broad general filters. This, but that's a risk.
Yeah, for an input database, you might have a cost center level, then Scott?
Yeah, real quick, just in reference to this, your model where you're showing there, talking about transparent partition.
Yeah.
When you use this swap out, do you have to rebuild the partition at all, or do they keep that definition?
You have to drop the partition first.
Thank you, you're a great straight man. Yeah, the second bullet there. If you have partitions, you should drop, we should have covered it.
Yeah, no,
You should drop them and recreate them. That's actually, I think, a good practice with partitions in general. I never like to set them and leave them. I'll write it in a Excel script. Because first thing, there's a validate command. You say, is this good? Then apply it. If not, you got a way out.
I think this is our last.
Any questions on this? Okay.
This is more of a tip than a trick, or is it more of a trick than a tip?
This is a trick.
This is a trick, yeah.
This is a trick.
We're heavy on tricks.
All right.
All right, guys, thank you. I know it's Friday afternoon, so
Yeah.
appreciate you guys staying for.
Oh!